Hello, we are Group 14, Intelligent Spatial Analysis during hurricane events, and I'm Kevin Rapkin. Feel free to scan this QR code to take you to our website, intelligentspatialanalysis.com, that showcases our project. What we have done is developed a way to quickly and effectively analyze millions of Twitter posts using artificial intelligence, labeling by category, hurricane relevance, and sentiment, and then plotting the data visually on geospatial maps, uncovering hidden trends that might prove useful in understanding the impact hurricanes have on a community. For example, after a storm passes through, we can determine areas where people are feeling angry about tree damage, information that could be valuable to a landscaping company looking to expand customers.
All right, so now taking a look at our key requirements and constraints. So we need access to Python for handling our data processing and actually developing our models. We also used Olama with LLMs for tasks like topic categorization and sentiment analysis. And for the relevance classification step, having properly labeled training data was important so we could distinguish between hurricane-related and irrelevant tweets. And we also need effective prompts for the LLMs to improve quality of our results. Lastly, we used QGIS to visualize our data spatially, and in terms of constraints, one major challenge was the quality of our training data since limited or noisy data can reduce model accuracy. We also had time and computational constraints, especially when working with large data sets and running LLMs locally, and the outputs from the LLMs can sometimes be inconsistent depending on how our prompts are written, so we have to keep an eye on that as well.
For our project design, the overall design remained relatively the same from start to finish. We had originally planned to process the data and run it through a series of machine learning models to determine their relevance to hurricanes and provide sentiment and category labels. Then we would visualize them through QGIS and analyze the result to draw useful conclusions for businesses, city officials, etc. After attempting to utilize machine learning models, we realized they lacked the complexity to understand the nuance of conversation and can only determine between positive and negative. At best, we managed to get it to also include a neutral sentiment category. But in a meeting with our sponsor, he heavily suggested that we switch to utilizing a prompt with a local LLM that could better understand and navigate human language. This proved to be a better method that we stuck with for the duration of the project.
Alright, so now taking a look at the implementation of our relevance classification. We first started by collecting and preparing our training data, and this dataset consisted of labeled tweets where each tweet was either marked as relevant or irrelevant towards hurricanes. And then once this data was prepared, we converted the text into numerical form using TF-IDF, which is essentially used to help capture the importance of words based on how frequently they appear in the dataset. And then after that, we trained a logistic regression model using these features from TF-IDF, where the model learns patterns in the data to distinguish between the relevant and irrelevant tweets. And then lastly, the trained model is used to predict whether a new tweet that we're passing through the model is related to a hurricane or not. And then getting this part is very crucial for us because it filters out the noise and ensures that only the meaningful data moves forward into the later stages of our pipeline.
For the sentiment analysis subsystem, our initial implementation involved training a model on datasets found on Kaggle, which would then determine positive, negative, and neutral sentiments. Our approach changed drastically because we wanted to find and view specific emotional categories such as anxiety, joy, fear, and so on, with much larger sets of social media data. For the final implementation, we run a command in the project directory that contains all of the necessary files, those being the CSV file that we upload, the config script, and the actual analyzer script. Olama must be running when we run the command that starts the script, and the analyzer takes a CSV file and the prompt from the config file and passes it to the LLM to give a one-word sentiment label to each tweet, and then it rebuilds the entire CSV when the process is finished.
Our data preprocessing tool builds a small CSV with only the necessary fields we need, like timestamp, message text, and coordinates. We can import this into a database to run queries, targeting only tweets made in the area impacted by a hurricane during its approach, landfall, and aftermath. Initially, we explored using BERT language models to do topic categorization, which had benefits such as speed, but eventually we decided to use large language models for their flexibility. Our topic categorization tool imports a CSV and prompts the LLM to label each line of text according to predefined categories, which we provide with descriptions. These categories can be edited, removed, or added to, making our system able to target just about any conversational topic you could imagine.
Okay, so now in terms of project testing for our relevance classification, so we will go on to compare our machine learning approach with an LLM-based approach to evaluate performance of the two. And then as mentioned earlier, we use TF-IDF and regression for our ML model. And then we will go on to compare it to an LLM-based classification method using Olama. So we would focus on three main factors when comparing these two, which would be processing time, classification accuracy, and the consistency of our results. And looking at these results, we would see that the machine learning model was significantly more efficient, and it was able to process the full Hurricane Florence dataset in about 10 to 15 minutes. And on the other hand, our LLM-based approach would have taken over 7 hours to process this whole dataset, making it much less practical for our large-scale analysis with comparable accuracy. So overall, the ML approach proved to be both faster and more suitable for this part of our system, and that's what we ended up sticking with.
For the sentiment analysis subsystem testing, we used human verification. So after running sentiment analysis on a small but diverse set of tweets that cover positive, negative, and neutral wording along with sarcasm, irony, slang, hashtags, etc., we manually reviewed the model's output and compared them to our own judgment based on the tweet's contents to either confirm or reject the outputs and make sure they were reasonable. We also checked the edge cases, including tweets with mixed sentiment and context-dependent phrasing. We then verified the system behaved consistently across repeated runs and didn't break during input issues such as empty text, links-only tweets, or unusual characters. When the output seemed poor, we documented the patterns, such as sarcasm being misread as always positive, and used those findings to create rules for each sentiment.
We labeled a sample of our data in order to test the effectiveness of our topic categorization system. We can accurately label 87% of messages by topic. This figure shows that much of the error is from our model favoring the off-topic category. But sometimes ambiguity, like a road closure being due to flooding, results in error if the model chooses flooding instead of road closure.
Alright, so now moving on to the importance of the relevance classification subsystem and why it was a key part of our system. So when working with social media data in general, especially during events like hurricanes, a major challenge is that the data that we're using contains a lot of noise, and many of the tweets are unrelated to the disaster we're studying. So even though they may mention keywords or happen around the same time, not everything collected is actually useful for analysis. So this is something that we had to approach and combat. And so relevance classification played a very important role in this, as it significantly reduced the size of the data set by filtering out the relevant tweets early in our subsystems and our pipeline. So this step also helped us make the data set much more manageable and computationally efficient, since we were no longer processing unnecessary information in later stages, especially since those ones are usually the ones that are going to take much longer to process data, since they're the ones using the LLMs. So this allowed us to focus our analysis on the most meaningful content that we had. And as a result of this, only the hurricane-related data would be passed on to the later stages of our subsystems. So this will improve the overall quality of our downstream analysis, including sentiment analysis and topic categorization, and even spatial mapping using QGIS, since we will only be focusing on the relevant data. And by ensuring that these components only worked with the relevant data, we reduced our errors and improved the reliability of the insights that would be generated later on. So overall, this step acted as a foundation for the entire pipeline in a way, as it made the rest of the system more accurate and effective.
Now I'm going to go over some of our findings from our analysis. For Hurricane Michael, when viewing the tweets all over Florida, it appeared at first that the coastal regions experienced more anxiety, which was to be expected. But what classified a county as coastal or inland is that it just needed to be touching the coast, so therefore a majority of tweets were labeled coastal, and the percentage of coastal tweets that were labeled as anxiety was actually lower than the percentage of non-coastal tweets that were labeled as anxiety. So furthermore, upon viewing all of Florida meant that areas not really being impacted by the hurricane could skew the data, and that led me to narrow my analysis to only include the impact region. When I narrowed my search, I found a pattern in Leon County where many of the citizens were anxious and angry, and I wanted to know what it was about, so I filtered the data by anxious and angry labeled tweets, colored by topic, and found the most common topics appeared to be power outages and tree damage. The tweets that were angry and anxious about the power lines and tree damage were calling on the city to cut down trees, but also voicing their concerns and complaints about poor power company response times. For Hurricane Florence, the area studied was the impact area, which made up portions of North and South Carolina. The patterns found there were fairly similar. A majority of the tweets were labeled as anxiety, especially those found on the coast, but even the tweets in major cities further inland were dominated by anxious tweets. Some of the flaws within our system are due to the fact that geolocation data is hard to collect since many users utilize VPNs or do not allow their location to be recorded. Other times, the location defaults to a city or a specific set of coordinates, which means one dot could actually be hundreds to thousands of tweets, which makes the visualization not as accurate. So this made validating what we saw with our eyes via plots important to the conclusions we made during our analyses.
We obtained data on the hurricanes from the National Hurricane Center archives for the 2018 hurricane season in order to get a fuller picture of the effect of these storms by visualizing their impacts alongside our labeled Twitter data. This allowed us to look for correlations between wind speeds and what people were talking about or how they felt. Here we are looking at Hurricane Florence's wind swath as it made landfall in North Carolina. The red shaded area experienced hurricane force winds, while the yellow shaded area experienced less severe tropical storm force winds. Visually, it is already apparent that the people in the direct path of the storm were posting with more anxiety, as shown by the blue dots. The green dots indicate humor and are concentrated in the less impacted areas. This is confirmed when we plot emotion distribution by wind zone, with anxiety increasing as wind speeds increase. Something we didn't expect to find, however, is that politics was discussed much less in the areas experiencing higher force winds. Our theory is that the people more severely impacted by the storm had other things to worry about rather than arguing politics on the internet. Here we can see the same analysis, but for Hurricane Michael, as it impacts the Florida Panhandle. Once again, a clear concentration of anxious messages in the line of the storm. Humor, likewise, decreases in areas with stronger hurricane force winds. It is interesting to see that there is a large concentration of power outages being discussed in the middle wind zone. But if we look at the map, we can see this area encompasses Tallahassee, a large city where outages could impact many hundreds of thousands. Tree damage is a little more discussed in the area to the west, which is much more densely forested as well as being hit by stronger winds. This makes sense with this added context.
Alright, so now we have a project demo for our relevance classification system in action. So on the left we have Hurricane Florence and on the right we have Hurricane Michael, and these just show the temporal cones of uncertainty along the hurricane paths mapped into QGIS, and these cones were taken from the NHC, the National Hurricane Center's archives of the storms. So we found those KMZ files and imported them into the QGIS so we can map them and give them a temporal aspect. And what we've done here essentially is overlay the relevant tweets onto these maps, and you will see the tweets appear progressively over time following the movement and progression of each hurricane. And essentially this helps us visually confirm that our relevance classification was working correctly, since the tweets are not randomly distributed but instead align with the expected hurricane timeline and path. And this also demonstrates how our system improves the overall analysis by linking social media activity to real-world spatial and temporal hurricane behavior, and overall helps validate that our filtered tweets were meaningful and can enhance our analysis and be used in further subsystems.
So when you first load the QGIS data, our CSV with the sentiment labels and topics, you'll see something like this. Currently I have the neutrals in, but as you can see, it's real messy. But for Hurricane Michael, it hit right up through this area. I can show that with the path overlay. And this is dominated mostly by anxious tweets. Now, if we want to get a better picture, we're going to want to activate the impact layer and filtered by topic. This specifically is power outages, and here you can see everyone in this area is mostly anxious about power outages. So yeah, that's the basic functionality after uploading the data into QGIS. And as you can see, there's a trend between the tree damage and the path of the hurricane and also the power outages.
Here's a brief demonstration of how we used QGIS to analyze our data with these storms. All right, so this is Hurricane Florence, and one thing we can immediately see looking at the map here is all these blue dots. These are tweets that are tagged as anxiety, and those are mostly concentrated in the direct path of the storm, whereas the green and yellow, that's humor and joy, they're concentrated more outside of the direct path. But let's say we want to isolate and just look at the tweets that are in this red shaded area. This is hurricane force winds, or this shaded area. These are just the tropical storm force winds, and we can look at just those tweets in isolation. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can do an extract by expression, and so this is going to isolate just the 64 knot winds from this layer. So we'll click run, and there we go. That's right there, the 64 knot winds. And so we can do that 3 times, and so we can get the 34 knot winds, 50 knot, and the 64 knot winds. So if we want to obtain a layer with just the tweets from the 64 knot winds, we can do an extract by location. So we're extracting the features from here that intersect or are within the 64 knot wind layer. So we run that, and there we go. And so we have all the tweets isolated into 34 knot winds, 50 knot winds, and 64 knot winds. And we can look at these and look for correlations between what kinds of tweets are happening in tropical storm force winds versus hurricane force winds.